We want you, Shane.
Joey, there's no living with a killing. There's no going back from one.
Some westerns are bigger and more ambitious, like The Searchers. Others are tighter and full of suspense, like High Noon. Some feel pure, such as 7 Men from Now. And some explore deeper psychological themes, like The Naked Spur. But no other western hits as deeply on an emotional level as Shane. Throughout the entire film, we see the story through the eyes of a young boy. This boy is much like many boys over the last 150 years. He grew up first reading cheap Western novels and stories, then watching silent films, and finally experiencing the rise of Hollywood's Western movies. These stories built a powerful mythology that fueled the dreams of countless young people across the country. Shane is a movie about that very mythology. It closely examines how we idolize Western heroes, layering the story with rich emotions that feel genuine and lasting. The film's emotional journey is clear and powerful, unmatched by any other Western, with every element working together to create a truly memorable experience. However, what you saw on screen was just a part of what actually happened. Sit tight as we unveil a layer of Shane that you've never seen before. Shane was first a book director George Stevens and screenwriter A.B. Guthrie Jr. took Jack Schaefer's 1949 novel Shane and made it better for the screen. The story feels a lot like tales of brave knights in shining armor who travel the countryside helping those in need. Shane starts at one of those moments. A lone gunfighter rides down from the mountains into a valley. There, a young boy named Joey Starrett, played by Brandon DeWild, watches him from his family's farm. Shane meets Joey and his parents, Joe, played by Van Heflin, and Marion, played by Jean Arthur. But before Shane can be properly welcomed, Joe mistakes him for a member of the Riker gang, a group of troublemakers who show up at Joe's claim shortly after. The Rikers claim that the Starrett's land belongs to them. Joe almost runs Shane off his own land. Shane, however, senses something is wrong and stays nearby. When the Rikers catch sight of the mysterious stranger, they decide to leave. Joe realizes he was wrong about Shane, invites him to stay for dinner, and soon asks him to stay on as hired help. Right from the start, young Joey and Marion are drawn to Shane. Joey looks up to him, fascinated by his gun and the way he carries himself. Marion tries to impress Shane too, bringing out her finest china for dessert and showing off her feminine side. Before long, Shane becomes a beloved part of the family and settles into the local life, trading his white buckskin and gun for simple farm clothes. But his attempt at a normal life is constantly under threat. The Rikers continue to try to force Joe and the other homesteaders off their land. Eventually, they hire a ruthless gunman from Cheyenne named Jack Wilson, played by Jack Palance, to do their dirty work. As one character puts it, that's the trouble with this country. There isn't a lawman for 100 miles. Joe is pressured to go into town one night to meet with Rufus Riker, played by Emil Meyer. Shane knows this is a deadly trap for Joe. He accepts that he is the only one who can protect the Starrett family and the other settlers. So he straps on his gun and white buckskin once again and heads into town for a showdown with Wilson and the Rikers. Turner Classic Movies says Shane is as visually expansive as High Noon is claustrophobic. Shane is one of those films whose individual moments add up to something more than the whole. Clayton Moore had problems with the producer. The Lone Ranger had fallen on hard times and was working for the villain, Riker. He also took part in the saloon fight where Riker's men brawled with Shane. At the time, Clayton Moore, who played the Lone Ranger, was in a contract dispute with the show's producer. He was fighting for a raise, and he eventually got it. Still, fans think it's wild that in the meantime, he ended up playing a hired thug. Shane hugely impacted many Western films. Shane inspired parts of Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars and Once Upon a Time in the West. In fact, Clint Eastwood's whole career was shaped by the themes and ideas in Shane. Though we shouldn't forget his awful Pale Rider, which is basically a cheesy remake of Shane that can make you laugh. You can see Shane's influence in movies like High Plains, Drifter, and Unforgiven. You can even spot similar elements in Michael Cimino's great film Heaven's Gate, which also deals with the Johnson County War. What really makes Shane stand out, though, is the strong emotional connection it creates. This comes from telling the story through the simple eyes of the Starrett family, especially young Joey. Joey sees both the arrival and the departure of our hero Shane. He witnesses many important moments in the film, such as the fight in the saloon between Shane and Calloway, played by Ben Johnson, in which Joey watches from just under the saloon door. He also witnesses the tense fight between Shane and his father in their yard, and most importantly, the final shootout between Shane and Wilson, after Wilson follows Shane all the way from their home into town. Even though Joey is innocent and trusting, his honest perspective on things helps the audience connect deeply with him. Watching the story unfold through a child's eyes allows the audience a very different emotional experience. Instead of analyzing the events, fans feel them on a more instinctual emotional level. However, it's not just Joey's point of view that's portrayed. Marion's perspective also adds another layer to the story. Jean Arthur came out of retirement to star in Shane. Jean Arthur, who played with a delicate mix of sensitivity and fragile femininity, came out of a 5-year retirement to star in this movie for George Stevens. At 52 years old, the experienced actress delivered one of her finest performances. She beautifully plays the devoted wife, caring mother, and quietly longing woman who looks at Shane with deep feelings she can hardly express or control, caught somewhere in the middle. Her longing shines through in a simple, powerful moment after the family returns from the saloon fight. She is bandaging Joe's and Shane's wounds, then leaves to say goodnight to Joey in his room. When she comes back to the main room, she sees that Shane has stepped outside. She watches him from the open door, then turns around and walks over to her husband. Without a word, she simply says, "Hold me. Don't say anything. Just hold me." It's not just the audience who senses that Marion and Shane might have something between them. Riker even comments to Shane about how lovely Marion is, which makes Shane respond sharply. Toward the end of the film, Joe tells Marion he believes she will be looked after if anything happens to him. One of the movie's biggest improvements over the book is how Marion's character is developed. In the book, she comes across as flighty and unsubtle, but Jean Arthur brings a real honesty and depth to Marion that the book doesn't have. The most beautiful and tender moment in the film happens between Marion and Shane after Shane knocks Joe unconscious during their fight in the yard. Joey, feeling hurt and betrayed because his hero hit his father with a gun, tends to Joe's wounds. Marion approaches Shane, and in their quiet moment together, so much is communicated by what remains unsaid. Shane, Jack Schaefer's runt. When Jack Schaefer watched the 1953 film version of his beloved novel Shane, he had clear ideas about how his mysterious gunfighter should look and feel on screen. Schaefer had spent years shaping Shane as a dark, deadly figure. He imagined someone who would cast a long shadow over the Wyoming landscape and capture the dangerous mystery of the American frontier. So when a reporter asked if he enjoyed seeing his creation come to life in Hollywood, Schaefer gave a brutally honest and surprising answer. "Yeah, I did. All except for that runt," he said, pointing directly at Alan Ladd, who was only 5 feet 6 inches tall. Schaefer had pictured Shane being played by George Raft, a much taller actor known for his truly menacing presence in crime films. Raft had the dark, intimidating quality Schaefer believed was key to making Shane believable and powerful. The author's criticism wasn't just about physical size, though Ladd's smaller frame didn't match the strong, imposing figure Schaefer had imagined riding across the plains. In a 1989 interview at Oberlin College, where he was receiving an honorary doctorate, Schaefer shared more about what he thought about the casting choice. He explained that his Shane was meant to be someone truly frightening, a man whose violent past showed clearly on his face and whose very presence made decent people nervous. Instead, Alan Ladd gave a softer, more sympathetic take on the character. While Ladd's performance became iconic and helped make the film a classic, it marked a big departure from Schaefer's original idea. The author's runt comment became one of the most famous examples of a writer openly rejecting Hollywood's version of their work, showing just how differently creators and filmmakers can picture the same character. In his 2008 Guide to Westerns, Stagecoach to Tombstone, Author Howard Hughes says even Paramount was hesitant to cast Ladd as Shane. His films never made more than $2,500,000, and the producers worried they were limiting the film's potential by making it a Ladd movie. However, this has remained debatable to date. Shane was released 2 years post-production. Though the film was shot in 1951, it didn't come out until 1953. The delay happened because George Stevens took his time carefully editing and re-editing the film. This is pretty obvious in the way he uses different points of view, camera angles, edits, sound effects, and music. At a time when most movies were edited and released just months after production ended, this kind of extended post-production schedule was almost unheard of in Hollywood. Stevens was already known in the industry for being a perfectionist, but even by his standards, the editing process for Shane was unusually slow and incredibly detailed. He had shot an enormous amount of footage, capturing multiple angles and takes for nearly every scene. This left the editing room packed with hours upon hours of raw material, far more than most directors would ever use. But for Stevens, this was intentional. He spent months experimenting with different combinations of shots, adjusting the pacing, and fine-tuning the emotional rhythm of each scene to get the exact effect he was after. Of course, this slow process created major headaches for Paramount Pictures. The studio had expected Shane to be released much sooner, and they watched in frustration as the film sat unfinished. Costs continued to rise, and potential release windows came and went. They were also paying interest on the investment, which only made the delays more painful. But in the end, the extra time Stevens took in the editing room helped shape Shane into a film that felt emotionally powerful and far more impactful than it would have been with a rushed post-production schedule. The funeral accident. One of the most strangely dangerous moments during the filming of Shane happened during what should have been an easy funeral scene. Director George Stevens was chasing the perfect shot, but he almost caused a crew member to be buried alive by accident. The scene needed a dog to look sadly into an open grave, which sounds simple enough, but dogs don't naturally know how to act sad on command. Stevens kept trying over and over to get the dog to look down into the grave with a sad expression. The dog, however, refused to cooperate and kept looking everywhere except where the cameras needed it to look. Growing frustrated but determined to capture the emotional moment he wanted, Stevens came up with a creative idea. He told the dog's trainer to climb down into the bottom of the 6-foot-deep grave and lie there quietly. He knew the dog would naturally look down toward its familiar handler. The plan worked perfectly at first. The dog finally looked down into the grave just as Stevens wanted, while the trainer stayed hidden at the bottom of the hole. The crew then lowered a coffin filled with rocks to give it the right weight and a realistic look for the scene. Everything went smoothly until a musician on set, a harmonica player, was so moved by the quiet moment that he started playing the sad tune Dixie. The haunting music created a powerful atmosphere that resonated with the entire crew. They became genuinely emotional watching the scene. So caught up in the moment, several crew members began shoveling dirt into the grave as part of the burial, forgetting that a living person was still lying at the bottom. Luckily, someone quickly remembered the trainer was there before anything bad happened. This near accident became one of the most talked about close calls in the history of the film's production. Shane's fear of firearms. Alan Ladd's portrayal of Shane as a cool, confident gunfighter was so convincing that no one guessed the actor was actually terrified of guns. In fact, he often fired weapons with his eyes tightly shut. This fear created one of the most ironic moments in Hollywood history. A tough actor who was genuinely scared of the very props that made him famous. Ladd's fear of guns became clear during one of the film's most memorable scenes. Shane shows young Joey Starrett how to handle a revolver in the family's backyard. Shane fires several shots to prove his skill with the weapon. This scene was meant to show Shane as a dangerous man who was also willing to teach the boy who admired him. However, Ladd kept his eyes closed while pulling the trigger. This fact was especially clear because the camera zooms in on his face during the shooting scenes. His discomfort is impossible to hide for viewers who know what to watch for. This wasn't just a one-time thing early in the 1950s. Throughout the whole filming, Ladd showed how uneasy he was with guns, and his aim suffered because of it. In later action scenes, especially during the big saloon shootout, a careful look shows that Ladd's pistol often points away from his supposed targets. This is especially true in the final fight, where Shane kills Riker's brother. The irony is even stronger when you remember that Ladd made much of his career playing deadly gunmen. His big break came as a cold-blooded hitman in This Gun for Hire, and he kept playing tough guy roles like that through the 1940s. Jack Palance's inability to mount his horse. Jack Palance's strong, intimidating presence as the villainous gunfighter Jack Wilson in Shane was so convincing that no one guessed he was actually nervous around horses. He had a lot of trouble with basic skills such as mounting and dismounting. This caused big challenges during filming because Wilson was supposed to be a skilled cowboy who felt at home on horseback. Before filming began, Palance was popularly known as a theater actor. He had little experience with horses or guns, spending most of his career on Broadway stages rather than Western movie sets. When he arrived in Wyoming for Shane, his lack of horseback skills quickly became clear to director George Stevens and the crew. This caused delays as they tried to work around his difficulties. The most difficult scene was Wilson's introduction at the Star Ranch. Palance was supposed to dismount from his horse for a tense face-off with Shane, then get back on and ride away like it was no big deal. After many failed tries, Palance finally pulled off one perfect dismount that looked natural and menacing on camera. Stevens knew this might be their only good take, so he filmed Palance's dismount in slow motion and then played the footage backwards to make it look like a smooth, easy mount. This smart camera trick fixed the immediate problem, but Palance's overall riding skills stayed so awkward that Stevens had to rethink how to introduce the character to the audience. The original plan was for Wilson to ride into town at full speed, making a dramatic entrance that portrayed him as a skilled horseman and dangerous opponent. However, Palance looked very uncomfortable and unsteady whenever he rode at a faster pace. As a result, Stevens had to change the scene completely. Instead of a galloping entrance, Stevens filmed Wilson riding into town at a slow, deliberate walk. This change actually made Wilson's character even more menacing. The slow, calm pace suggested a man so confident in his skills that he didn't need horse tricks to scare his enemies. One scene required 119 takes. What should have been Shane showing young Joey how to shoot turned into one of the challenging parts of the whole production. Director George Stevens continued filming again and again until he was finally satisfied with the result. In this scene, Shane fires his revolver to prove his skill with guns and build his bond with Joey, the boy who admires him. Stevens saw this as a key moment to show Shane's talent and his willingness to teach Joey. Every detail needed to look perfect on screen, but the mix of Alan Ladd's obvious fear of guns and Stevens' perfectionism caused many problems. Ladd's nervousness, closed eyes, and shaky handling ruined many takes. At the same time, Stevens rejected even good takes if they didn't match his exact vision of how the scene should feel and look. Crew members who watched the long filming session later said it was both tiring and a little ridiculous. They saw the same short moment happen again and again, with only small changes each time. Every time the take failed, they had to reset the cameras, fix the lighting, reload the prop gun with blanks, and have Ladd and young Brandon DeWild return to their starting point to try again. This entire process took up a full day of shooting and utilized a significant amount of resources. All this effort was for a scene that lasts less than 2 minutes in the final movie. Budget for the movie unexpectedly went through the roof. On top of everything else, the production faced terrible weather in Jackson Hole. Rain caused constant delays, pushing the schedule back again and again. The shoot went far over budget and took much longer than planned. But despite those setbacks, the film did extremely well at the box office. It earned $20 million on a budget of $3 million. Paramount almost sold the movie. What started as a simple Western turned into a financial nightmare for Paramount Pictures. The studio originally planned Shane as a modest B picture. They wanted to shoot it quickly and cheaply, just like many Westerns made in the early 1950s. However, things didn't go according to plan. Director George Stevens had a different approach. He paid close attention to every little detail and insisted on filming every scene over and over again. His perfectionism dragged out the shooting schedule and sent the budget soaring far beyond what Paramount had expected. Week after week, the costs kept piling up. Studio executives grew more anxious as they watched the numbers rise with no clear end in sight. Eventually, the budget ballooned so much that Paramount seriously considered giving up on the project altogether. They reached out to billionaire filmmaker Howard Hughes, who had a reputation for throwing huge amounts of money at films other studios couldn't finish. Paramount hoped he might take over the production and rescue the movie from its financial freefall. In Hollywood, Howard Hughes had a reputation for spending big. He often stepped in to fund expensive movies that other studios saw as too risky. At first, Hughes turned down the offer. He didn't think the project had enough promise to justify the huge investment it needed. But then, something changed. Paramount gave Hughes a chance to watch a rough cut of the footage George Stevens had already filmed. As soon as Hughes saw it, he changed his mind. Hughes quickly offered to buy the entire film from Paramount. That sudden shift in opinion caught the attention of the studio's executives. Instead of selling the movie, they decided to keep it. They chose to release it as one of their major films for 1953. Brandon DeWilde was accused of stealing scenes. The most emotional scene in Shane turned into a behind-the-scenes circus, all because of 11-year-old Brandon DeWilde's playful behavior. It is when the wounded hero explains to young Joey why he has to leave and can never come back. That farewell scene was meant to be the heart of the movie. It's where Shane delivers his powerful line about how there's no living with a killing, just before he rides off into the distance for good. Director George Stevens had worked hard to set the perfect mood. The cast and crew knew this moment had to hit hard emotionally. Everyone was ready to capture something unforgettable. Alan Ladd came fully prepared to give one of his most heartfelt performances. He stood in front of the young boy who had looked up to him the entire film, ready to deliver his final words. However, Brandon couldn't resist stirring things up. Instead of staying focused, he kept cracking jokes and pulling silly faces during takes. What should have been a tearjerker turned into take after take of laughter and frustration. The entire crew had to stop and reset more than once because Brandon's antics kept breaking the serious tone Stevens had worked so hard to create. Eventually, after too many ruined takes, Ladd had had enough. He turned to Brandon's father, who was on set, and snapped, "Make that kid stop or I'll beat him over the head with a brick." The comment was clearly a joke, but the message landed. DeWilde finally stopped clowning around, and George Stevens was able to capture the powerful farewell scene that audiences still remember today. Shane debuted widescreen by accident. Shane became the very first film to show off Paramount Pictures' new widescreen technology, but not because George Stevens planned it that way. It happened purely by chance. The movie was mostly filmed with long and medium shots, which worked perfectly when the image was cropped for widescreen. At the time, Paramount executives were scrambling to find a film that could showcase their new projection system. Shane just happened to fit the bill. In the early 1950s, Hollywood studios were racing to develop widescreen formats. They needed a way to compete with the growing popularity of television, which was pulling people away from movie theaters. Paramount had poured a lot of money into creating their new 1.66:1 aspect ratio system, but they still needed the perfect movie to debut it. Most films back then were shot using the standard 1.37:1 Academy ratio. That meant converting them to widescreen required cropping the top and bottom of the image, which often ruined the original shot composition. Luckily for Paramount, Shane's style of filming survived the crop beautifully. The movie ultimately introduced audiences to widescreen cinema almost by accident. George Stevens imported cattle for some scenes. George Stevens was obsessed with making Shane feel as real as possible, right down to the smallest details on screen. That's why he decided to bring in cattle from faraway places instead of using the local Wyoming herds. The local cattle looked too prosperous and well-fed for the harsh 1980s setting he wanted to show. The story takes place during a time when cattle ranching was a tough and often brutal business. The animals had to survive harsh weather, scarce food, and the challenges of frontier life. Stevens wanted the cattle in his film to reflect that reality. He needed them to look lean, weathered, and roughened by the tough Wyoming environment. But when the crew scouted the Jackson Hole area for filming, They quickly realized the local herds were just too healthy and well cared for to look like livestock from the 19th century. The Wyoming ranchers of the 1950s had access to modern veterinary care, better feed, and improved ranching methods. Because of this, their cattle looked clearly cared for in ways that would have been impossible back in the late 19th century. Instead of settling for the healthier local herds or hoping audiences wouldn't notice the difference, Stevens imported cattle from other regions. Montgomery Clift and William Holden were first cast as Shane and Joe Starrett. Montgomery Clift and William Holden were first cast as Jane and Joe. However, they turned it down. Even after they left the project to take other roles, director George Stevens didn't try to bring them back. Instead, he chose Alan Ladd for Shane and Van Heflin for Joe. And honestly, many fans think the movie turned out better because of it. Garbage sounds were used to make gunshot sounds. George Stevens didn't want the gunshots in Shane to sound like typical movie gunfire. Instead, he wanted to emphasize how deadly firearms really are. To do this, Stevens came up with a unique sound effect trick. He fired real weapons directly into garbage cans to create loud, echoing reverberations that sounded like cannons. This gave the gunshots a deep, booming quality that startled viewers. During World War II, Stevens led the Signal Corps Special Motion Picture Unit. He filmed some of the war's most brutal moments, including the D-Day landings and the liberation of concentration camps at Dachau and Nordhausen. Those experiences fueled his determination to portray violence realistically. These shots occur during the scene where Shane demonstrates his shooting skills to young Joey. A stunt double did Shane's fancy gun twirling. The impressive gun twirling that makes Shane look like a master gunslinger during the big saloon showdown was actually done by skilled stunt performer Rod Redwing, not Alan Ladd. This was another case where the actor's discomfort with firearms forced the production team to get creative. These complex gun maneuvers required a high level of confidence and expertise. During the film's most intense confrontation, when Shane faces Jack Wilson and the other bad guys in the Grafton saloon, the character shows off several elaborate gun spins. Pulling off these sequences took perfect timing, steady hands, and a deep familiarity with the revolver's weight and balance. However, Alan Ladd had a well-known fear of guns. Asking him to perform those tricky moves would have been dangerous and probably wouldn't have looked convincing. The production team knew that audiences had to believe Shane was truly skilled with weapons. That meant the gun handling needed to look smooth, confident, and effortless. To make that happen, they brought in Rod Redwing, a firearms expert known for his flashy and precise gun work. Redwing was hired specifically for the scenes that required impressive gun spinning. The filming was carefully set up so he could perform the moves while keeping the illusion that Shane was doing it all himself. This difference becomes especially clear when you compare it to an earlier scene where Shane shows off his shooting skills to Joey. In that moment, it's clearly Alan Ladd on camera, and the gun handling is much simpler and slower. For that scene, the props team gave Ladd a different revolver, one that was easier and safer for an inexperienced actor to use. It was a smart adjustment that let the scene work without pushing Ladd beyond his comfort level. The horses were terrified of the bear costumes. During the intense barn fight scene between Shane and Joe Starrett, George Stevens wanted the horses tied up in the corral to show real panic and hysteria. To make it happen, Stevens came up with a strange but effective idea. He had two crew members dress up in full bear costumes and run around the horses. This scared the animals and brought out genuine fear in their reactions. The fight scene itself was a crucial moment in the film. Shane and Joe worked together to fight off a group of Riker's men who had come to threaten the homesteaders. The horses' panicked reactions played a big role in selling the idea that a serious, violent fight was happening. It helped the audience feel the tension and unpredictability of the moment. However, getting horses to show real fear on command is very hard. These animals are usually well trained for movies and used to all the noise and activity on set. Just shouting or making loud noises usually wasn't enough to get the dramatic reaction Stevens wanted from the horses. This approach required careful planning to ensure the safety of both the animals and the nearby actors. Panicked horses can be dangerous and unpredictable. The crew had to time the bear costume appearances perfectly to get the right reactions while making sure no one got hurt during the fight scene. The movie used hidden wires for violent deaths. George Stevens created a groundbreaking special effects technique in Shane by using hidden wires to yank actors violently backward when they were shot. This made gunshot impacts look shockingly realistic. The technique later influenced famous films like The Godfather, Part 2, and Bonnie and Clyde. The effect stood out most in the scenes where Jack Palance shoots Elisha Cook Jr. and in other gunfire deaths throughout the film. Instead of having actors just fall or stumble backward like usual, Stevens rigged them with hidden wires attached to their bodies. These wires connected to pulleys operated by crew members out of the camera's view. At the moment a character got shot, the crew yanked the wires with force. This jerked the actor backward suddenly and violently, surprising audiences with its raw, intense realism. This technique created the illusion that bullets hit their victims with tremendous physical force. It made the gunshots seem far more deadly and powerful than the gentle falls that most movies showed back then. The wire technique worked so well that it became a standard way to create realistic gunshot effects in movies. Later filmmakers such as Francis Ford Coppola and Arthur Penn adopted and refined this method for their own violent scenes, helping to set a new standard for realism in action films. Which of these facts surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this dive into Bourne's world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more movie facts.